Okay, at the end of the last video, I asked these two questions. Would immortality be desirable, and would it be, to what degree is it even imaginable? And so I want to say a little bit more about both of these. In particular, the first one, would it be desirable? Because a lot of this chapter on death and immortality that I've provided to you may tries to ask, well, what can we think about? What kind of hypothetical or thought experiment, hypothetical scenario, can we come up with in order, that's supposed to be scenario, sorry, scenario, can we come up with in order to meaningfully discuss the possibility of immortality? And so he wants to make a kind of argument which tries to think about the nature of immortality and what might be the best way possible to make it seem like it's the most desirable. And so in doing that, he sets up a number of different parameters as best as he can. He says, well, under the condition that we're immortal, we might not want to age to such a degree that we have to deal with certain kinds of issues or problems of being elderly, whether it's losing one's memory, losing one's family or friends, being immobile, losing one's strength and vitality, and so on. And so he suggests maybe it's the case we could think about immortality as if we're born and we grow up as children, and then we get to a certain kind of age, and he thinks somewhere between, say, the mid-20s to one's mid-30s or so. And you can pick whatever age you think would be the ideal age to stay for the rest of your infinite life. And that's the point at which you stay. When maybe we have this idea that this would be the ideal framework for thinking about what the best moments of a life would be. And so if we take a life somewhere between the mid-20s and mid-30s, and we don't age past that so that we don't suffer the effects of old age, this might be a way of thinking about making the prospect of an infinite life really desirable. And it seems as though there would be lots of ways to think about immortality being desirable. For instance, there are all kinds of things that we could do that we cannot do now. We might be able, I mean, you can think about this in your own terms, but we might be able to take up more projects, more commitments than we are able to if we're mortal. We might be able to travel more, to visit new places, places that we'll never see, perhaps in our own given lifetimes. We'll have more relationships with countless other people who we meet along the way. And it seems as though if it's the case that we were immortal, we wouldn't be limited to just the kinds of things that we take up, say, in school, or the kinds of careers that we end up having, or the specific people that we meet. There would always be time where we can try out new things, where we can take up new hobbies, where we can play the saxophone, or we can play the drums, or the violin. We can take up a new sport and try to get better at it. We can exercise in different ways. We can, see new places and so on. Take up new business ventures if we want to. And we wouldn't be limited in the ways that we are now. And that seems as though it would be extremely desirable. Moreover, there's a specific way that May suggests that immortality would alleviate a certain kind of problem that we might have in our lives. And that has to do with the problem of regret. It seems as though in our own lives, in our mortal lives, we might come to regret some of the things that we've done, or some of the things that we just didn't do, we didn't get around to doing. But if we're immortal, it seems as though we don't have to have this feeling of regret. There will always be more time to take up those projects or those travel commitments or those relationships that we've been neglecting in the past forms of our lives. And so I just want to read part of that real fast. This is on 58 and 59. May writes, "If we were immortal, we would not face certain kinds of choices. Those choices, our lives would not be constrained by the choices we do make because we would be able to make others. I could be a philosopher and then be a novelist. I could ride a bike from New York to Arizona as I once hoped I would. Infirmity and mortality would not impose on me the necessity of selection. And in this sense, it would eliminate one of the great sadnesses of life, regret. It would not eliminate all regret, of course. I could still, for instance, do things to others that I would come to regret. However, there's a certain and devastating kind of regret that immortality would eliminate. A teacher of mine once said that the saddest thing in life, aside from parents having to bury their children, is to lie on one's deathbed and have regrets. You know the kind of regrets he was referring to. Not regrets about what or who one could have become. The kind of regrets he meant were those associated with who or what one tried to become. Or better, allowed oneself to try to become. To fail to become something one works or trains or educates oneself for is a disappointment. But it pales in comparison to the regret of wondering whether one could have been that if one had only taken one's chances. And so it seems as though immortality would help alleviate or even eliminate that kind of regret. There are lots of reasons that people tend to think that immortality seems very desirable. But May wants to suggest, even in this kind of best case scenario, that in fact, if we reflect on immortality a bit longer, it just wouldn't be desirable in the ways that we initially think it might be. And he says a number of things, he gives a number of arguments for why it's the case that he thinks immortality would actually be undesirable. But I just want to focus on a couple of them. One, he puts it this way: there seem to be both external and internal threats that arrive from the prospect of immortality. Well, what's the external threat? The external threat seems to be that when we're reflecting on this, we need to try to understand, or at least imagine, just how long an infinite life would be. Which is to say, to imagine what it would be like to live forever. And if we start asking ourselves, well, how long could I engage in certain projects, or even engage in certain relationships? Could I do this forever? Could I do it infinitely? Could I learn to play the saxophone? Not just for 5 years or 10 years, not just for 80 years, not just for 300 years. Could I do this for thousands of years? And it seems as though, even if one became an expert or a master at playing the saxophone, at some point, it's going to give out in terms of wanting to bother anymore. That one might have mastered it to the degree where there's nothing new to learn. And this isn't just the case with one kind of activity or practice or hobby, May thinks. It's that when time goes on forever, we start to lose entirely the shape of what a life would amount to. Our lives become totally shapeless. Because another part of the external threat is that even if there are other things that we might want to take up that we're not going to be able to in our own lives, maybe learning all kinds of languages that we will never learn, taking out new instruments or hobbies or sports or careers and so on. Eventually, May thinks, we're just going to run out of things to do. Even if we are inventing new things to do, inventing new instruments or forms of music or new genres of writing and so on, eventually we're going to run out of different kinds of practices. And moreover, even if we had more and more practices, there's some things that we just don't want to do anyway. Think about some practices or subjects of study maybe in school that you just have completely no interest in. And so just being told that one can always take these up is no consolation, it seems. And so trying to imagine what it would be like to engage in these practices and activities for so long, thousands of years, millions of years, seems to be the real external threat of not having any kind of shape of a life left if we were immortal. And it connects up with the internal threat in this way then. Because May suggests that given that we always have time to take up new things, it might be psychologically debilitating to be immortal. In what sense? In the sense that we would have no motivation to actually take up any specific project and be committed to it. Why? Because there doesn't seem to be any reason to do that now versus doing it 10 years from now versus doing it 2 weeks from now versus doing it 10,000 years from now. If we know that we can always take up the flute sometime down the road, there just doesn't seem to be any motivation to do it now versus doing it later. And so in this way, this is where the story of the troglodytes from Borges seems to give a parallel. They don't care about their own city because they don't care about the upkeep of or the maintenance of their city, because there doesn't seem to be any motivation to actually improve the city or to do much of anything at all. And so it's these two threats when combined, and this is the quick loss, which seem to sap the very notion that an immortal life would be desirable and that it could possibly give any meaning to what a life would be like. And it's along with this that we start to realize, and this is the second question, we start to realize the imaginative limits of what it would be like to have an immortal life for millions of years and beyond that. And along with other kinds of imaginative issues like, well, if I were immortal and everyone else around me were immortal and people were still being born, where would all these people be? Would there be enough room for them? Even if we started colonizing other planets? Or would people be able to feel pain or pleasure in a world in which we were all infinite, immortal beings? If we know that we can't die, what happens if we get into a car crash or we fall off a cliff? And notice that these seem to be real limits to imagining what it would be like to be immortal, because it's nothing like our lives here on Earth at all, in a sense. And so he is relying here upon a certain kind of intuition which stems from a thought experiment. But it's part of what engaging in that thought experiment involves, May would suggest. It shows just why it's so important that we die and that we're aware of it. Because death, in that sense, constrains and shapes, in the sense that I have here, it shapes both the ways that our lives go, as we have an outlook upon the future, but also shapes and constrains our very imaginative possibilities for what a life would entail. And so the last thought I want to suggest from May here is this. It seems as though mortality, the fact that we are going to die one day, is a threat to our existence. It seems as though it provokes the question, is life meaningful? But immortality, if it's undesirable, if May's right about that, would seem to be worse. Why? Because it might level or reduce or eliminate the meaning of a life altogether. And so mortality, though it has this arbitrary element of an uncertain death, at least gives the possibility for leading a meaningful life, as opposed to immortality. And this is the tension that May identifies at the end. It's this tension between the somewhat undesirability of a mortal life and the undesirability of an immortal life. But they have different aspects which don't allow them to be equal in the same sense. And so as you are reading this chapter, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about May's thought experiment and what you think about the desirability and imaginability of an immortal life. Okay, thank you.